Throughout the past few decades, far-right groups did not hold the same political influence as they do today. So why are they gaining such political leverage now? Is it too late to combat their growth? I spoke with Yascha Mounk. He's an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University. Why do you believe our freedom is in danger?
Well, I think what we've seen over the last years is the very rapid rise of authoritarian populists around the world. The four biggest democracies in the world are now ruled by authoritarian populists. You can travel all across the center of Europe without ever leaving a country ruled by populists. And what we see in each of these places is that because they say that they alone are legitimate political forces, that anybody who disagrees with them is illegitimate, should not be listened to, is an enemy of the people, a traitor, they tend to expand their power once they're in government. They go against individual rights, against independent institutions, and ultimately they make it impossible to remove them from government through democratic elections.
So in the past, you've advocated for what you call inclusive nationalism to combat the alleged threat of aggressive nationalism. So explain those two concepts.
Yeah, so when you see what kind of damage nationalism has inflicted around the world, when you look at the history of the 20th century, which was marked by exclusionary, aggressive, dangerous nationalism, it's very tempting to say perhaps we need to move beyond all forms of nationalism and simply give up on those forms of collective identity. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that's realistic because most people have a strong form of collective identity, and I don't think it's realistic because it neglects to what extent nationalism has sometimes been the thing that has allowed us to bypass our allegiances based on ethnicity, our allegiances based on religion, on our own family, on our own region, in order to have real solidarity with people who are far away from us. So in my mind, the best way to combat the big historic force of nationalism is to domesticate it, is to fight for a form of inclusive nationalism that actually is able to make us see that we have things in common with people who are far away from us geographically, who have a different ethnicity, a different religion, because we all, for example, have a common attachment to the ideal of the American nation.
But wouldn't inclusive nationalism just simply mean patriotism? In other words, my parents were born in another country. They're now naturalized Americans. They are patriotic to this country, which has embraced them. I was born here in this country. I'm a patriotic American. Isn't that sort of what you're defining as inclusive nationalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Distinguishing too strongly between patriotism and nationalism makes sense on a conceptual basis, but I think it misses the point that we're talking about the same underlying reality. So it's tempting to say nationalism is all bad and patriotism is wonderful, so let's embrace patriotism and there's never going to be any danger. That's not how I think about it. The way I think about it, patriotism, nationalism, it's the same thing. It's a half-domesticated animal that can be stoked by the worst kinds of people to become really dangerous, but that can also be harnessed in its potential for good. And even when you do that, it's still going to remain dangerous. It will still always require our vigilance to make sure that it's put to positive uses rather than to negative uses. That's why I don't distinguish between patriotism and nationalism so strongly. It's a force that can be positive, it can be negative, and there's no safe patriotism, there's no safe nationalism. That's why I think it's the same thing.
Really interesting. So for years, liberal democracy, as you know, has been the cornerstone of the Western world. Can you point to any crack in that could be causing this change that we've seen across Europe?
Yeah, liberal democracy is an incredibly powerful ideal. It is the promise that we should have individual liberty, that we have individual rights, that minorities have rights, but we get to say or not say, worship in the way we think right, lead the private lives we think fit, irrespective of what the majority wants. But it is also a democratic element, that we collectively decide on our political fate rather than leaving it up to dictators or priests or generals. And those two ideals can come into conflict. We need to make sure that the majority of people keeps voting for policies that respect individual rights, that respect minority rights, for politicians that don't want to abolish the rule of law and the separation of powers. And a lot of the reasons why we've been able to support that for the last decades is that democracies have been very successful, that they offered people, for example, a very rapid increase in their living standards. And as democracies have become less good at actually delivering concrete benefits for people, a lot more of them have become impatient with the system and more willing to vote for authoritarian strongmen who say, trust me, let me do my thing, even if it means sacrificing the rights of minorities, even if it means undermining the rule of law and the separation of powers.
So let's talk about the people and the governments that represent them. Have the relationships between individuals and politicians changed? I guess, is the trust between the two eroded?
The trust between people and the government has definitely eroded. Part of it, as I've been saying, is about...
I just want to say, Yascha, as you know, people are naturally suspicious of government, but there's always been a symbiotic relationship, right? We elect individuals to represent us and to represent our interests and our needs. And in that, there's an implicit trust that exists there. But is that, I guess, what's being eroded?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this trust is being eroded. The trust is being eroded in two ways. The first is simply that governments have, frankly, delivered less for ordinary people. The easiest measure that people have of whether the government is looking out for them is simply whether their lives are getting better. And when they don't feel that their lives are getting so much better, they tend to have more mistrust. That's one of the big things that's happened. The second thing, and there I think political elites need to be a little bit more self-critical than they tend to be, is also that they've started to think, we sort of know better than a lot of ordinary people. We have all of this expertise, we know how to do this. And so when people tell us that they have a strong preference on certain kinds of policy, that perhaps they don't want more free trade, or even that, as in many European countries, they're strongly opposed to immigration, we know better than them and we should do our thing. Now, often I agree with the judgment of political elites on substantive issues, but I think we need to take the lesson that that's not possible in a democracy, that you need to actually persuade people to agree with your policies, and when you don't manage to do that, you should defer to popular majorities on the policies, because when you don't do that, they start to rebel in pretty extreme ways.
Yascha, I just have time for one more question. So is one reason why we've seen the rise in populism and in the embrace of leaders that, you know, let's face it, democracy is probably, it's a fairly young political ideology. And yet, when you look at the millions of people who have lost their lives by embracing either populist leaders in the 1920s and the 1930s that brought several countries to their knees, have we not done enough to educate this generation about what happened in previous generations and how to avoid that?
Yeah, I think the rise of populism is an opportunity in one specific sense, which is that we've started to take for granted the stability of democracy. We've started to take for granted that we would always enjoy the peace and prosperity that we do have at the moment. And it was difficult to motivate people by pointing to those moments in the past where that wasn't the case. Well, that past doesn't seem as remote today as it did 5 years ago, and we're seeing in lots of countries around the world, in Turkey, in Venezuela, and Russia, and many other countries, how terrifying dictatorship can be, how much damage authoritarian populists can do to how ordinary people live. And so that is a real opportunity for us to point back to the fundamental values of our political system, to that promise of individual liberty, that promise of collective self-determination, which I think remain as powerful as they've always been. The problem is not that people don't like those ideals, it's that we've started to take it for granted. And so if in this moment all of us who are partisans of liberal democracies go out and fight for those values and go out to make reality accord to those values better than they ever have in the past, make it an opportunity to improve the world rather than just a dangerous moment to defend the status quo, then I think democracy can flourish going forward.
Well, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and it seems as if we are at that tipping point at the moment in 2019. Yascha Mounk, thank you so much. Really interesting discussion. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Coming up, the Swedish police weigh in on the issue, why one veteran officer believes the so-called migrant problem is often misunderstood and taken out of context. You're streaming CBSN.